This week on Christian World News, famine in East Africa. 22 million people are at risk of starvation. The rush to save the children. Plus, in one of the world's oldest Christian nation, they are under assault from its Muslim neighbor. How the war in Ukraine is rekindling an ancient conflict in Eurasia. And her son was murdered in front of the entire world. How faith brought this mother through the grief and given her the strength to forgive. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Christian World News. I'm George Thomas. Every 48 seconds, one person dies from hunger in the Horn of Africa. Severe famine, not seen in more than 40 years, is now ravaging the continent. Many of the victims are children. A perfect storm of back-to-back drought, COVID-19, and fallout from the Ukraine war have combined to create dire conditions. Here's a first-hand look at the growing crisis. Fatuma Abdi Aluhu has just buried her two sons here on the outskirts of Mogadishu, Somalia. She lays a thorny branch on their graves to protect the bodies from wild animals. Both died from starvation.
I wanted to die before them so they could bury me, but both of them died before me.
Somalia and its neighbors in the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia and Kenya, are facing unprecedented drought conditions.
We've had 4 failed rains. The drought that we're currently seeing in the Horn of Africa is the worst drought in over 40 years.
On average, one person dies every 48 seconds from hunger in the Horn of Africa.
Because of the drought, many water sources have dried up. Many wells have also dried up.
With crops failing, the United Nations says some 22 million people are at risk of starvation. Many of them farmers who only grow enough food to feed their own families.
People will be forced to flee to look for food. People will have to try and find a way to survive. And obviously this entails very perilous journeys for people who are already marginalized.
Many in the region who rely on livestock for livelihood have seen massive numbers of their animals wiped out.
For example, in northern Kenya, we've lost about 1.5 million heads of livestock. Similarly, in southern Ethiopia, we've lost over 2 million. In Somalia, we even stopped counting.
In Somalia alone, around 8 million people, or half the population, are experiencing crisis hunger levels. 1 in 3 children face chronic malnutrition.
I've been shocked to my core these past few days by the level of pain and suffering we see so many Somalis enduring. Famine is at the door.
Anne Kasambo oversees CBN's offices in Kenya. In partnership with Operation Blessing, they've been distributing food and other aid supplies to some of the hardest-hit regions of her country.
It's been quite devastating in some communities, and especially in the arid areas where even when there's rain, food is hard to come by because they're not able to grow their food.
4 consecutive droughts and African economies still reeling from the coronavirus pandemic have created these dire conditions.
As if that was not enough, the situation has been aggravated by the current conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine.
Before the war, Somalia imported 90% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, while Ethiopia imported 42%. Kenya, which also imports oil, iron, steel, and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine, imports 44% of its wheat from both countries. All that has come to a screeching halt since war started. The result? Skyrocketing prices for practically everything.
It has really affected us, especially on food prices. It has also affected the cost of fuel.
When the fuel prices go up, the production cost is higher, so everything is affected.
A new survey found most Kenyans are increasingly turning to their savings or taking out loans in order to meet the rising cost of living.
It's been a build-up from COVID to inflation, to drought, to the war in Ukraine. So just before one situation gets better, another one crops up.
In late August, the first ship carrying grain from Ukraine docked on the Horn of Africa, offloading some 2,300 tons of wheat.
That's enough wheat to feed 1.5 million people for about a month.
Food experts say that's a drop in the bucket, considering the immediate crisis facing millions across the Horn of Africa. Coming up, an ancient conflict comes roaring back while in one of the world's oldest Christian nation is under assault. We will tackle that story in a moment. Folks, welcome back to Christian World News. Ukrainian troops made stunning gains against the Russian invaders this week. An offensive in the north drove out thousands of Russian troops who left weapons and ammunition behind. Ukrainian President Zelensky visiting the liberated city of Izium, watching as the Ukraine flag once again flies overhead. The Ukrainians taking back thousands of square miles, freeing many towns and more than 150,000 people. And sadly, discovering evidence of more atrocities. Azerbaijan, the war in Ukraine is having far-reaching consequences. Russia's dwindling influence is leading to flare-ups of violence in former Soviet nations, including in one of the world's oldest Christian countries, Armenia. Chuck Holton has the story.
Just after midnight on September 13th, Azerbaijan launched a large-scale attack against its neighbor, Armenia. It's the latest battle in a long-running conflict between the Muslim-majority Azerbaijan and Armenia, a country that claims to be the world's first Christian nation. But the attacks on Sunday have more to do with money than with religion. It's the worst attack since 2020, when Azeri forces pushed into the exclave of Artsakh, taking lands populated by Armenians since the time of Noah. CBN was there to witness how the Azeri military put little stock in the value of civilian lives.
So you see this car right here was hit by cluster munitions. All of these little holes are from the thousands of projectiles that are thrown out by these things. They are definitely not meant for civilian areas. They're meant for troops in the open.
The most recent attack looks to be no different.
We have several civilians wounded. The attacks were not only against Armenian military positions, but there were attacks against Armenian civilian towns and villages. Several homes have been damaged, including municipal buildings. So it was an attack against military and civilian infrastructure.
In the current conflict, Azeris aren't attacking a remote area, but Armenia proper. And the objectives have everything to do with the current war in Ukraine.
People here in Armenia are understandably disturbed by the images they see coming out of Ukraine, but it's difficult for them to take a stand against Russia when Russia is the only country that stands between Armenia and their enemies to the east in Azerbaijan.
It's extremely concerning because they are attacking the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia, escalating this situation, this theater of hostilities to an all-time high, and it's a very, very dangerous situation at the moment.
The reason they want that is the connector between Azerbaijan and the autonomous country of Nakhchivan to Turkey. And that will allow them to have a pipeline of oil.
Indeed, Western leaders have been meeting recently with Azerbaijan's president to discuss how to get more of the country's oil to make up the shortfalls from Russia this winter. That may have emboldened the Azeris to make this move.
I think this is about money. I think this is about taking those lands right now, because that's where the majority of the attacks are happening.
The U.S. government has so far refrained from condemning the attacks, calling instead on both parties to return to the negotiating table.
There can be no military solution to this conflict. We urge restraint from any further military hostilities. We also encourage both governments to reestablish direct lines of communications across diplomatic and military channels, and to recommit to a diplomatic process to resolve the crisis.
Armenia relies on Russian peacekeepers to uphold a 2020 ceasefire. Given the distraction of the war in Ukraine, Russia may be unable to keep a lid on the hostilities here. That runs the risk of pulling Iran into the conflict, which moved troops to the border on Monday, saying it would not stand for any change in Armenia's territorial borders. While Azerbaijan desperately seeks a path for its oil to the west, many Armenian Christians see something deeper with the current conflict.
I believe this is a spiritual attack. This is a spiritual battle that has been stirred up against them. So pray for the strength and the faith, and that the gospel will continue to go forth here in Armenia, and that it will go forth in these countries that are attacking, because that is the only way we'll have peace, is in Jesus Christ.
Chuck Holton joins me now for more. So, Chuck, what is the historical grudge Azerbaijan has against Armenia?
Well, strange enough, George, this goes back to the Russians, to the Soviet Union. During Stalin's time, the Armenians, very homogenous group of people in that area, and he wanted to break that up to make them less of a threat. So he moved Muslims into that area, and they created the country of Azerbaijan in 1917 out of essentially. And so it was intended to be a place where these people were in conflict. And after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, that conflict burst into war, and the Armenians took over an area that was Armenian territory basically since forever, since Noah. And they held that up until 2020. Azerbaijan has made a lot of money on oil, and they used that money to build up their military to the point that they were able to take back a lot of that in the Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. And now we see that Azerbaijan, Armenia proper. That's a real concern for the 3 million people who live there.
Yeah. So I'm curious, the Russians are in the region. They have peacekeepers there. What are they doing?
Well, Russians sort of forced a ceasefire back in 2020 and were essentially Armenia's only friend in the region. Armenia doesn't have any oil. They don't have any resources to give. But that strip of land between Russia and Iran is very important geographically. And so Russia sent about 2,000 peacekeepers in there to maintain that ceasefire. They've been unable to maintain the ceasefire so far. There have been flare-ups since 2020. And what we're seeing now is that Azerbaijan so that they can move their oil through. And I tell you, the Armenians are pretty disappointed to see Western leaders cozying up to Azerbaijan, acting like it's such a big deal for Russia to invade Ukraine, but now not wanting to say anything about it when Azerbaijan does the same to Armenia.
Yeah, okay. Chuck, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, coming up, a mother's faith in the face of an unimaginable nightmare. We'll have that story in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. It's been 8 years since the public beheading of American journalist James Foley by ISIS terrorists. CBN's Gabe LaMonica spoke with Foley's mother, Diane, who credits her faith with giving her the strength to endure and to meet one of her son's killers face to face.
This is James Wright Foley.
After their son's brutal beheading was seen on screens and smartphones around the world, the Foley family walked out of their home in 2014 to face a crowd of cameras.
We know Jimmy's free. He's finally free. And we know he's in God's hands. And we know he's done God's work. And we know he's in heaven.
The Foley's faith overpowering that impromptu front yard appearance.
Every time we started to get despondent all over these 2 years, we thought of Jim. I mean, we thought of Jim and his courage, and in the midst of his suffering, he was helping the other prisoners. I mean, there were a couple of much younger people in that cell. Jim was one of the older ones, and he would sometimes just hold one of them, we're told.
James Foley's drive to tell stories led to his capture in 2011 and being detained for 44 days in Libya at the hands of loyalists to then-dictator Muammar Gaddafi.
I remember getting photographed with a cell phone. My bloodied head from the blows, getting photographed up close and thinking, you know, this is where they find all these photographs that are evidence of war crimes someday, and realizing this is me now.
Less than 2 years later, Foley was back in the field covering the Syrian civil war. There, he was captured and later infamously beheaded by Islamic State terrorists.
The first thing you lose in war is the truth, right?
Now, nearly a decade since the death of her son James, Diane Foley's faith sustains her.
I've been very blessed and certainly blessed with the faith that's given me a hope and a strength to endure and to know that Jim's in a better place.
It's through that lens that Foley sees her son's killers.
Our Lord didn't put Jimmy in that situation. It's people who we people are capable of some very nasty things. We Western nations in our country have not been lily white, let's face it. We've done some nasty stuff ourselves after 9/11, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. We have some things to hang our own heads in shame.
Even taking the extraordinary step of meeting one of those men face to face.
I met with him 3 times, and I felt that was helpful. I felt it was helpful for Alexander and for myself. I know Jim would have met with him. He wouldn't have wanted me to be afraid of him. And he would have wanted me to let him know the kind of who Jim was. It was the right thing to do. If I truly feel I'm a Christian, you know, that we should be willing to talk to one another, even and hopefully at some point forgive one another.
The Foley Foundation estimates at least 67 Americans remain captive or imprisoned abroad.
Return of Americans is still not a priority.
Foley believes the U.S. could have done more for James and must do more now for those other Americans held around the world. Gabe LaMonica, CBN News.
Welcome back. When more than 100 Jewish orphans and others fled from war-torn Ukraine 6 months ago, they found a short-term home in Israel. As CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl shows us, the group is moving forward with their lives here for now, given the uncertainty back home.
A rabbi and his wife led the orphans, other children, and staff out of Ukraine and found a safe landing outside Jerusalem. The sign behind me says Bruchim Habaim. That's welcome in Hebrew. And these Ukrainian refugees have certainly felt welcome here at Nes Harim for the last 6 months.
The half year we were here was the most wonderful half a year. We didn't know there was such a thing in the world, that they would receive us with such love.
People really opened their hearts and their arms to us and just did whatever they could to help us out. So that was really amazing. And we feel that. It was very, very, very heartwarming.
Rabbi Shlomo Wilhelm and his wife Esther led the Jewish community in Zhytomyr, Ukraine for 27 years before fleeing the war. Now their entourage is leaving Nes Harim for the Israeli coastal city of Ashkelon, where they'll stay for at least a year.
But it's very much a transition period, which means we always knew we wouldn't be able to stay here forever. So it was like we got used to life here, and now we have to get ready to go on.
There's no contradiction between good and bad. Everything good comes with difficulty. All of life is a challenge. All of life is about continuing to go forward. Everything new is like the peel of a seed. Before a tree starts to grow, the seed decays in the ground and then a new tree grows.
CBN News first met the group shortly after their arrival in Israel. It came during the Purim holiday, when Jews celebrate deliverance from evil, as told in the book of Esther. We've continued to follow them, such as when the kids' teacher from Ukraine made a surprise visit, and now for their farewell party. Gili Maimon manages the Nesharim Field School and became hero and friend to the children.
This was a very, very special project that Kakal did together with the Israelis. We will miss them and we wish them a lot of success on their new path.
Irina Kabakova says she has mixed emotions.
I feel, a bit sad, yes, because we are leaving, and happy, yes. I'm in a good mood. I'm here for my children. I hope they will have great future here.
Nesharim is a field school of Keren Kayemet LeYisrael, Jewish National Fund, also known as Kakal. It's normally a place where youth groups and others come to hike and enjoy nature.
Kakal is an organization of all the Jewish people. We say that every Jew here in the land and in the diaspora has a share in Kakal. Therefore, it was clear and natural that we would help the Jews in Ukraine.
CEO Ben-Ami says Kakal also is helping Jews still in Ukraine with humanitarian aid.
It was our privilege to fulfill part of the goals, part of the aspirations of Kakal. It was exciting, it was humane, and it really emphasized how important Kakal is, not only for Israel, but for Jews around the world.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Nesharim, Israel.
Thank you, Julie. Finally, this week, we leave you with scenes from London. Thousands upon thousands of mourners waiting patiently in line to pay their respects to Queen Elizabeth II. The viewing at Westminster Hall opened 24 hours, and the line stretching as long as 5 miles. Some waiting as long as 4 hours to view the casket. King Charles II and the royal family overwhelmed by the public show of affection, expressing sincere gratitude for the support from all around the world. Folks, that is it for this week's edition of Christian World News. From all of us here from the headquarters of the Christian Broadcasting Network, we wish you a fantastic rest of the week and a great weekend ahead. Goodbye, and God bless you.